Judea. I'm a journalist. I'm doing a book with the New Press, which we love. In this case, a 20th anniversary revision of a book called Don't Believe the Hype about race, the media, and African Americans, which is sadly more timely than ever. But I am just delighted to be a part of the New Press, and I thank you all for being here to celebrate and support. So I want to thank everyone at the New Press for welcoming me. I had a nice coffee yesterday with Diane Wachtel, the executive director, and yes, cheers, she will be speaking later. And then I want to thank Zakiya Henderson Brown, who's my very patient editor. Woohoo! So, you know, we are here not just to celebrate the New Press, but also to honor Bob Bernstein and Toni Morrison, two heroes of the publishing industry. And they share the New Press's mission of strengthening our democracy and creating a more equitable world. And of course, they are testaments to the power of the pen to bring about social change. So many of you here tonight have been long-term supporters and friends of the New Press, and others are maybe just getting to know how groundbreaking this publisher is. So to tell you a bit more about the New Press, I am delighted to introduce Gara LaMarche. His day job, small day job, is president of the Democracy Alliance, a partnership of progressive philanthropists, and Gara is also a New Press board member. He's been involved with the New Press almost from its beginnings in 1990, when he was head of the Freedom to Write program at the PEN American Center. And in 1996, Gara joined George Soros's Open Society Institute, where he directed all of the U.S. programs. He continued his steadfast support of the New Press as president and CEO of Atlantic Philanthropies. So without further delay, let me please introduce Gara LaMarche.
Thanks, Fry. I was very, very delighted to be asked to come on behalf of the New Press Board and make some opening remarks, and also to present an award to my friend and colleague and mentor of 25 years, Bob Bernstein. But I was a little disturbed when I got here tonight and I saw the program, and it had the title of my introductory remarks, something like The Importance of the Written Word. Now, even somebody as occasionally ponderous as me would find that kind of a daunting exercise. So what I had planned to say, and hopefully it'll fit under that rubric, is just to say a little bit about the importance of the New Press. It is true that I've had an association with the New Press over many years, until in the last couple of years I was honored to be asked to serve on the board. I mean, the New Press really stands against a lot of the trends in our culture, the emphasis on clicks and all that kind of stuff that has really been dominant just in the last couple of weeks. And it really was founded as one of the early steps against those trends in the publishing industry a little over 20 years ago. It was part of the vision for the New Press, was the vision of Andre Schifrin, our founder and our longtime board member who died earlier this year. Bob, as you'll hear a little bit probably from Andre, as you'll probably hear a little bit from Bob, was part of the Random House organization, of which Bob was the president. And it was a series of events about the emphasis on profitability that kind of led Andre out of Pantheon and into founding the New Press, which has been a nonprofit publishing house for over 20 years. What the New Press stands for is about bringing voices into the debate in this country and around the world that otherwise often don't get a hearing and maybe find it hard to be published other places. You look around the room, you see the placards around here about some of these books, and you realize that, you know, Lisa Delpit published with the New Press. I first read her there. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which has probably been, in our generation, the most influential book in setting the terms of the debate about mass incarceration, and has really sparked and reflected a social movement, is a New Press book. Just in terms of the events of the last couple of days with the torture report, it's the New Press that published David Cole, some of his groundbreaking work on civil liberties. It published my friend and colleague Fritz Schwartz, and will publish him soon in a book on secrecy, government secrecy. Ai-jen Poo of the National Domestic Workers Association is publishing a book with the New Press very shortly, as is Carolyn Fredrickson, my colleague and friend from the American Constitution Society, who's here, who's going to have a book about women in the workplace that is adds some voices and perspectives to what you may not get from Lean In. So the New Press continues to be continues to be really the leading force in the publishing world, I think, in the United States, adding those kinds of voices to the debate. When I was in philanthropy, I was privileged to be able to provide some grants to the New Press because we found both at Atlantic and at Open Society, and Atlantic, by the way, well before my time, had been one of the initial investors in the launch of the New Press over 20 years ago, that if you wanted to make an investment in advancing the debate on some of the most difficult issues in our society, on criminal justice and education reform, on race, on the law, on a whole host of issues, the New Press was the place to do that. You get a good bang for your buck, and because books in our society, with all the changes and the meretriciousness of our culture and our public debate, books still are the primary currency for the delivery of ideas and information in this society. And the New Press is a vital organ in that respect. Now, I want to get to Bob, my friend Bob Bernstein. Bob, there's a poetry, of course, in honoring Bob tonight because of Bob's role at the dawn of the New Press and his relationship with Andre and his staunch support for the start of the New Press. Bob, was a longtime president of Random House. I know him, and his publishing life is storied. Everything about Bob is a story. But I know Bob for 25 years through the human rights movement because I was privileged to work for Human Rights Watch beginning in 1990 when I first met Bob, and he was still at Random House. Bob is a mixture of somebody who has a strong and passionate moral vision that is at his core, and also what you would call now, and you might not have called then, a social entrepreneur, somebody who is both passionate and moral and creative about institutions and a creator of institutions. Our mutual friend Jerry Labor told me a day or two ago that she first met Bob in 1975 when he was picketing with her on a rainy day in front of the Soviet embassy carrying a placard, Justice for Buzansky, Bukansky, I'm sorry. But Bob actually, is the kind of person who is able to translate that into action and in institutions. And so, Bob, as a publisher, chaired, probably founded, I believe, the Freedom to Publish Committee of the Association of American Publishers, which I also worked with for a while, and some of the people in this room served on that. It pushed the leading publishing association in the United States into a forceful position on behalf of human rights around the world, led delegations all over the place where publishers and writers were being threatened. He then founded the Fund for Free Expression, of which I was the second, I guess, executive director beginning in 1990. That was a committee of distinguished citizens that had on it writers like Ed Doctorow and Toni Morrison. It had civic leaders like Bishop Paul Moore and Marietta Tree and a whole host of people who organized themselves around fighting for freedom of expression around the world in the United States. And out of that grew the founding of Helsinki Watch in 1975 after the Helsinki Accords, which very few people at the time thought would be the force for human rights that it became, for holding the Soviet world and the United States, which was a signatory to the human rights standards in the Helsinki Accords. Out of that groundbreaking work was founded America's Watch, and Bob had a vision for a global Human Rights Watch. And Human Rights Watch, which is today the leading human rights organization in the world with enormous global presence, is a result of Bob's vision. But that's not enough for Bob. Bob is always creating institutions. When I was at Human Rights Watch, he created the Committee to End the Chinese Gulag and campaigned against the China getting the Olympics in whatever year that was. I don't know, in the 1990s. I can't remember. They eventually got it, but not as soon as they would have. And he's been a force in human rights for China. For Bob, the personal is political. It's not just that Bob has had his own passion about it. It's not just that he has been a creator of institutions and somebody bringing institutions in the world that long after all of us are gone will be fighting for and protecting human rights. But he has formed relationships with the Sakharovs, with Jacobo Timmerman, with the activists in Tiananmen Square in China. These people become his friends. He is their mentor. He is their supporter. It's all for Bob, both in his publishing life and his human rights life, about the story. And the story is about lives. And you can't have a conversation with Bob about human rights or anything without being brought back to the essential human reality of all of this. That is at the core of it for him. That has motivated him to be the voice he is, to be the creative force that he has been over many, many decades now. I wanted just to say, finally, that for Bob, a storied public life such as he has had in publishing and in human rights and in other areas often is accompanied by, often I have found, sadly, the people who are public figures are often in their private lives a little inattentive, but that is not the case of Bob. Bob has an enormous, vital family life. His a tremendous partner, Helen Bernstein, over many, many decades, has been a partner in crime, I guess you would say, all this stuff over the years. But he's also somebody who describes himself as and is known as a sun worshiper. His three sons, Peter, Tom, and Bill, are in their own lives, in their own families, reflect the passions of Bob, whether it's publishing or human rights or social justice, and in their professional lives and in their civic lives, really carry out that vision. And I know that's being carried on in the subsequent generation of Bernsteins. So I would like to ask you to join me in paying tribute to Bob. Bob is sometimes an exhausting friend. He calls us all to a higher moral vision, and that is always important and always necessary, not always fun. When people have said of Bob, you need to calm down a little bit, Bob's response to that always has been, I don't calm down, I calm up. So for your vibrant, continuing life's work to protect and advance human rights over now in your 10th decade of doing that, I want you all to join me in presenting the 2014 New Press Social Justice Award to Bob Bernstein.
I don't want you to think I'm losing my memory, but I just don't have same-day delivery anymore. I want to thank Gara. I used to have a sign in my office that said, there's no limit to the good you can do if you don't want the credit. But as I've grown older, I've discovered there's no amount of praise I can't get accustomed to. And then to justify it, I always quote Dizzy Dean. You know old Dizzy Dean. He pitched for the St. Louis Cardinals. And he said, if you've done it, it ain't bragging. Let me start by saying how honored and delighted I am to be sharing this evening's honors with Toni Morrison. Without being unduly modest, I believe most of you have been attracted to this event by the chance to hear and see this fabulous woman. This is the second time in my life when I've been especially fortunate in sharing a speaking platform. Many years ago, I was asked to give a speech on human rights in New Delhi, India. I wondered who would come. When I arrived at the venue, I saw that the hall was jammed with 1,500 people. Just before I spoke, I heard that the next speaker was the Dalai Lama. So thank you, Toni. Next, I have to tell you a quick word about living 64 years with my amazing wife, Helen. Among her many attributes, she has a way of making up words. For example, she would explain tonight as being interdigitated. Because the word wasn't in our Random House dictionary, I thought it didn't exist. But recently I found out that it does. As you will see, for me tonight is truly an interdigitated evening. I started with Tony. Now a few words about Andre Shiffrin. Around 1962, Bennett Cerf and Donald Klopfer, the two wonderful men who founded Random House and hired both me and Andre, bought Pantheon Books. The Wolfs, who had started the company, had just published Dr. Zhivago, retired, and left Andre as editor-in-chief. At that time, Random House offices were in the wonderful Villard houses between 50th and 51st Street, just behind St. Patrick's. There was a most charming little building right around the corner, and that's where Pantheon moved. I didn't see much of Andre except at sales conferences until 1965, when all of a sudden Bennett Cerf announced he would retire and I would succeed him as CEO and president. In 1966, not only did I become the head of Random House, but Random House was sold to RCA. It became immediately obvious that I had been cast into the role of ridding the world of small publishers and not of big business. To do this, I kept Knopf, Pantheon, Vintage, Modern Library, and Ballantine editorially independent, as they has always been, sharing sales and financial backing. I explained to RCA that we didn't have a 5-year plan in publishing, at least one that I was aware of, but we just muddled through. To those of you who knew Andre, that arrangement suited him fine. We compromised on having an annual review. And when it came time to review Pantheon, in marched the financial people. They explained that Pantheon had lost a little money and perhaps should cut back. They acknowledged that backlist sales were up, but still suggested strongly that I tell Andre that he just has to make a profit. Andre would arrive at my office shortly after the financial department. He would explain that the reason he didn't show more of a profit was due to the overhead assigned to him, which he didn't control. He didn't need a 40 or 50-person sales department. After all, Pantheon had sold more than 1 million copies of Dr. Zhivago with 2 salesmen. He didn't need the space just off Madison Avenue. A beat-up brownstone in Greenwich Village would do just fine. He suggested that he be judged by Pantheon's list and pointed out that cutting any of it would leave the sales but still have the same overhead that he didn't control. All I can say is that I heard this story 25 times over 25 years. I guess I was convinced. Shortly after I departed in 1990, a new Random House president felt differently, and Andre was dismissed. Following the dismissal, the street in front of Random House's offices at 50th Street and 3rd looked like Occupy Wall Street, as acclaimed authors and Random House editors alike protested and vented their anger. What was to become of this publisher, who seemingly didn't understand that publishing should have a profit every quarter and certainly every year? Well, we now know what happens to a publisher that thinks differently. We are celebrating Andre's wonderful creation, the New Press. I stand in awe as I think of the fantastic job of starting a new small publishing house in this day and age of giants. First, the idea of financing it as a 501c3 is brilliant. Add to that setting up the printing arrangements, the distribution, the publicity, finding brilliant young editors, and the office space to house them. That was a great mistake, wasn't it? It's a pleasure to be here honoring Andre, who proved that finding worthy books was the hard part, and the rest required only a lot of determined work. The secret of all this success, of course, is hiring the right people. So we should also thank Andre for leaving Diane Wachtel and her wonderful and her wonderful staff to succeed him. Please note, I should stop here. However, I want to take a few more minutes to tell you two stories. The first about Pantheon, which I will use to introduce the second, which interdigitates back to Toni Morrison. While Andre wasn't a school book publisher, one of his authors was Jim Loewen, who published by the New Press, and who later became famous for publishing Lies My Teacher Told Me, published by New Press, and which Diane Wachtel not only edited, but has now sold over 2 million copies. Jim taught at Tougaloo, a historically black college in Jackson, Mississippi. The history of Mississippi was a required course in Mississippi high schools, and the book being used in the course described the Ku Klux Klan as a white people's organization necessary to protect themselves, and went on to depict the Native Americans' trail of tears from Mississippi to Oklahoma as necessary. Jim Loewen and another professor wrote a new history textbook, Mississippi, Conflict and Change, correcting this inaccurate point of view. No textbook publisher would touch it, as they thought they would lose all their business in Mississippi. Andre, of course, agreed to publish it instantly. Random House had acquired the L.W. Singer Company, a small textbook company in Syracuse, New York. Singer did business in Mississippi as well, and said if Pantheon went ahead and published Jim Loewen's book, they would lose all their business in the state. Andre came to tell me about his discussion with the Singer salespeople. We, of course, decided to publish the book. Andre always gave me a lot of credit for backing him up, but the real credit goes to Andre's recognition of the need to publish it, and, of course, Professor Loewen's determination to correct history. Back to interdigitation. One aside. Brown had an exchange program with Tougaloo. My son Peter participated in it during 1972. There'll be a pause for a commercial. And, of course, he took Professor Loewen's course. That's a minor point in the interdigitation story. Here is the major one. When we bought L.W. Singer, Bennett sent me up to Syracuse to see what I thought of our new division. I met a young editor who seemed brilliant. I asked her what she was doing in Syracuse, and she explained she had 2 sons to raise and saw Syracuse as a safer environment than New York City. I asked her, what would you like to do now that Random House has bought Singer? She said, well, of course, I'd like to be a Random House editor. I told her I'd just become president, and I thought that was possible. Her name was Toni Morrison. Quite a dividend for buying a small publishing house. There is, of course, a lot more to say about Toni Morrison, but that's for another time. So here's to a great evening, remembering and celebrating Andre, Diane, their new press, and honoring Toni. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for all of the many great things you have done, including hiring Toni Morrison. I love the fact of how vital you are and how many plates you can spin, including having a robust family and a lovely wife, and I just congratulate you, and I'm glad to be here with you. And Ms. Morrison, I mentioned that I had dinner with you in college, and it was one of the highlights of my college life because I was an undergrad at Harvard, and the head of the English department invited me to an intimate dinner, and I pretended to be knowing and funny and intelligent and all that stuff that you do when you're around Toni Morrison. But we'll get to more of that later, because right now I will not sing for you because that would be torture, although I could ask you to contribute money to the New Press to stop me singing. But the weather outside is frightful, but the auction items are delightful. If you want the show to flow, make it so. Bid away. Make it so. So I have to do that little interlude about the auction. So we have artwork at this silent auction. Some of it's over there by famed New Yorker cartoonist Edward Corin and illustrator Hugo Guinness. But there's also an opportunity to match whatever you do in the silent auction. There's a benefactor who's given $25,000 for a match, which is great. So everything that is sold in the auction will be matched, but you can also just make a pledge right here tonight at the auction table, and that will also be matched towards the $25,000. So I'd really urge you to maximize the funds, and the auction bids are open until 8:30. Now, back to our scheduled programming. So Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin is going to introduce our second honoree, Professor Toni Morrison. And Professor Griffin teaches English, comparative literature, and African American studies at Columbia University, where she has served as the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. She is the author and editor of several books and anthologies, including one of my favorites, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday. Farah was also a frequent contributor to NPR's News and Notes, which I hosted until 2009. Farah, please come on up.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Farai. Thank you so much. I have written remarks because there was no way I was going to wing it for the world's greatest writer. So I knew I had to write them down. Let me say that I'm honored to present this Toni Morrison with the New Press Social Justice Award. I've long admired the work of the New Press and learned a great deal from its authors. And of course, I've long worshipped at the altar of Toni Morrison and her incredible body of work, which includes a stunning array of novels from The Bluest Eye, published in 1970, to God Help the Child, which will be published in 2015 this spring, to her librettos, her edited collections on important contemporary issues and subjects, as well as her interviews. And to this body of work, I often add those works that she edited for other authors as well. As with most of you in this room, I first came to know Toni on the pages of her novel, and I'm not novels, all of them, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that each one of these encounters, starting when I was a teenager, from about the age of 13 through to middle age and gray hair, each one of these encounters on the page has changed my life. Reading her work has made me smarter, more thoughtful, more imaginative. And on the pages of her novels, I meet people in their fullest humanity and their capacity for growth, people who are often ignored or misrepresented by those in power. Toni brings to life for us. And over the years, I've also been fortunate enough to come to know her as a friend whose company and sense of humor I cherish. My laughter comes easy and deep in Toni's presence, sometimes silly, sometimes naughty, often giddy. That's the laughter, not Toni. It is always necessary and always joyful. And I welcome her insight and her opinion. During these exasperating and exhilarating days when young people once again take to the streets and pundits take to the airwaves, she reminds me by her example of the importance of the work, providing clarity, insight, and a keen, unrelenting observation is an important contribution to any people's struggle. By word and example, Toni has modeled a way of being in the world. She has a relationship to fame that strikes me as particularly healthy in these days of overwhelming celebrity. She is a public figure who manages to protect her privacy and to keep the attention on the work and its engagement with large historic, aesthetic, and political issues and concerns. She is an artist and intellectual who takes care with the words that she writes and speaks. So, it is indisputable that she is one of our greatest novelists. And through the beauty and depth of her prose, she has earned her place in the pantheon of the world's greatest writers. But tonight, I also want to acknowledge her importance as an editor. It is especially fitting that the New Press recognize Toni with this honor because it strikes me that the press's mission and Toni's interventions as an editor share much in common. So by their own announcement, the New Press notes that it's founded in 1990 to publish books that, quote, provide ideas and inspiration for activists, teachers, policymakers, and everyday citizens who are working to refresh our democracy. And this may very well be an editorial project shared by Toni, not only in her writing, but also in her work as editor. Now, she's often quoted as saying or having said that she wrote her first novel because she wanted to read it. Well, we wanted to read it too. But during her tenure at Random House, from 1970 to the mid-'80s, she edited books, not only books that we wanted to read, but books that we needed to read. She brought to the public the voices of revolutionaries, Huey Newton and Angela Davis, who narrated their lives, bore witness to the conditions that gave birth to their radicalism, and elaborated upon their political philosophies. She edited provocative and brilliant fiction writers like Toni Cade Bambara, Wesley Brown, Leon Forrest, Gail Jones, John McCluskey, and the poets June Jordan and Lucille Clifton. With Toni, emergent Black writers were edited with care and by someone who understood the world about which they were writing and respected the way they chose to imagine it, and that was not always a given in the publishing world. And with the project, The Black Book, she gave us both a history, but also a historical method, an accessible book that went on to spark the imagination and scholarship of a generation. During the heady days of another wave of social movement, Toni Morrison, the editor, asked, "What can I do from where I sit? How can I contribute to social change from the editor's desk?" And then she quietly helped to transform the landscape of American ideas and literature, and we are all the better for it. So I want to take this opportunity first to publicly say thank you, Ms. Morrison. For your life's work as a writer, as a public figure, as editor, and as witness, we present you with the New Press's 2015 Social Justice Award.
Thank you. Well, I was sitting here wondering, why am I receiving this award? And now, having heard Farah, I think I deserve it. I was trying to put together the things that have impressed me this evening. One is this place. This is lovely. I had always heard it was, but I was never here. And I'll be back. The other thing is remembering Andre Shiffrin. I used to have long talks with him. Some of them were longer than they needed to be because I always said, "What?" Because he talked like this, and he never raised his voice. But it was informative, and he was exceptional. And the other was, of course, my relationship with Bob Bernstein. who was the person who removed me from Syracuse and let me make a life for myself in his company, or that company, as well as in New York City. And he was rather extraordinary because I'd only been familiar with the management and the editors at L.W. Singer, who were very nice people, but obviously getting out of the business because they sold it. But I had never seen that kind of, relentlessness on the part of a publisher, an owner, the relentlessness that we all take for granted now when we think about Bob Bernstein, running around finding all these dissident authors and lunatics that nobody else was paying any attention to, and being open, and putting himself on the line, still does, for the ones that are not necessarily the quiet, the silent, the accommodating ones. That was, it was an extraordinary experience. And it was there, I didn't tell anybody, that I wrote or finished The Bluest Eye. I was writing a little bit of it when I was at L.W. Singer. And I even sent some pages of it out. Maybe I sent all of it. Well, anyway, I got 12 rejections. And I thought, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Most of them were little postcards, thanks a lot, but we don't need it. But one was a couple of letters where they really tried to be helpful. And one of them said, it's unusual, your language, but I must say that your manuscript has no beginning, it has no middle, and it has no end. And I thought, well, wonder what they were reading. At any rate, I finally got it published at Holt. And I didn't tell anybody when I moved to Random House because I thought they didn't hire a writer. They hired someone to edit. And I didn't want to confuse those two things. And if anybody has a copy of the first hardback edition of The Bluest Eye, you will notice some strange things. Like I insisted they put the first page on the jacket, which was stupid since nobody could read it. Also, there's no bio. My name is there, but there's nothing to say who I was. And that was deliberate because I didn't want the people at Random House to be confused about what my job was. And then they thought, and it was Bob, I think, who sent me up to Knopf and said, that might be a good place for you if you're going to write. So I went to talk to Bob Gottlieb, who said, I don't want to hire you because then I have to be free to fire you. And I think it would be better if I became your editor. That way we could have a publishing relationship that was not dangerous, because he needed the freedom to tell me to get out. And it's been a long time, but he still is my editor. So what work was I going to do? Now here is where I think where it might be accurate. I really have earned this prize of social justice. I will tell you how. I thought, having that experience, publishing The Bluest Eye, which was about an area of life that probably few readers that I knew, and certainly publishers, were not interested in, was very important to me for a number of reasons. The most vulnerable people, I thought, in the country were children, black children, female children, and also children who accepted the very worst evaluation of themselves. So here is a little girl who has all of those negative things already against her, who nevertheless feels dirty, ugly, and she wants out. I had read about black girls in other classical books, and they were jokes or throwaway lines. No one had taken them seriously. So when I began to solicit books, they were not all by African American authors, but a large proportion were. I wanted to be able to let them tell the story they wanted. I didn't want anybody to say to, I'm sure they wouldn't have, well, they might have, to say to Dumas or Angela Davis or Muhammad Ali or anybody, you have no middle. I mean, you have no beginning, no middle, and no end. I thought that I could guide them, help them, reveal whatever their narrative was the way they wanted to without, and this was important for me, without that gaze. You know, the white, well, you don't know, you may not know, but there is a critical white gaze. And if you write toward it, or near it, or because of it, it distorts your theme and your effort. But if you write out of it, or away from it, or regardless of it, the world is yours. In the same way that Tolstoy didn't write, for me, a little black girl in Lorain, Ohio, but I loved him. So that was the point, is not to censor yourself because of the prevailing, whatever you think the critical mode accepts. So whether I did poetry, or I did history, or I did essays, or novels, it was always important to me to do that, to make sure that they were comfortable without that gaze. And that would be the strength. And that was, I think, liberating for a number of them. I often say that one of the best books I had read by an African American writer was Ralph Ellison's first book. But what disturbed me about it was the title, Invisible Man. As I kept thinking, invisible to whom? Not to me. Because the address, if you understand it, was toward the gaze. And I wanted to remove that. So I did on a number of occasions where people listened to me. And I agree wholeheartedly that I, in that area, and perhaps in a few others, having been coerced by Bob Bernstein, that I really do deserve this prize of social justice.
Thank you. I'm not that tall. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Bob Bernstein and Toni Morrison for allowing us to honor you. It is completely thrilling just to be in the room with the two of you, and we're so grateful. This is the 5th annual New Press Gala Cocktail Party. My, how time flies. And it's very fitting, I think, that we're having it on December 10th, Human Rights Day. I want to congratulate both of our honorees and thank them again for allowing us to honor them. And I would like to add to Bob's remarks, particularly with respect to Jim Loewen. Jim Loewen heard we were honoring Bob. Jim is the guy who did the Mississippi textbook. Heard we were honoring Bob, couldn't be here. He's in D.C. But he sent me an email, and it gives the other side of the story, which is kind of fun. He writes, I first met Bob Bernstein in the company of Andre Schifrin in Bernstein's office at Random House. I was the senior author of a new textbook, the first so-called revisionist state history. I had shopped our book to 12 publishers before approaching Pantheon. Only Pantheon, under Andre Schifrin, said yes. Bob Bernstein wanted to meet me before approving the project, and even though it took place more than 40 years ago, I still remember that meeting. I said that we might have to sue Mississippi to get them to adopt our book. I cannot tell you how many other publishers, not grasping the difference between plaintiff and defendant, flinched when I said those words. Mr. Bernstein did not flinch. Ultimately, Mel Leventhal helped us to win an important First Amendment victory in Loewen versus Turnipseed, which the American Library Association today cites as one of the foundational cases undergirding Americans' right to read. It seems to me that Bob Bernstein's courage in approving the publication of Mississippi Conflict and Change is one more reason to fet him this evening, and I join from Washington, D.C. in raising a glass to him tonight. So, Helen, I have more interdigitation for you. Mel Leventhal, the attorney who represented Random House, went on to become New Press long-serving board chair for many years. Jim, as Bob said, went on to write a book that is still our best-selling book of all time, Lies My Teacher Told Me. Bob, I want to thank you for the many lunches we've had over the years, for your sage advice, for your introductions to luminary people and people I now have wonderful relationships thanks to you. And I want to thank you for your book ideas, some of which I actually managed to bring to fruition. And one of them I'm particularly proud of and is very relevant to talk about just briefly today. This book was Bob's idea. It's a book called Torture, and we published it with Human Rights Watch, an organization that Bob founded, as you heard. This book was done in 2005. It's so old, the pages are yellowed, and it's taken the country a decade to catch up. This book was so far ahead of its time. So I think it's very appropriate to hold this book up today. It's called Torture, Does It Make Us Safer? Is It Ever Okay? A contributing editor on this book was none other than Bob's daughter-in-law, Amy Bernstein, and we had the privilege of working with her. And the book is dedicated to Bob Bernstein, for the inspiration behind this book and his decades fighting torture worldwide. Could not be more fitting that one of the other editors, Minky Worden, is in the room with us here tonight also. Professor Morrison, I'd like to make a couple of connections between you and the New Press, some of which you're aware of, and one of which you may not actually fully be aware of. The first book I ever acquired as a young editor was a collection of short stories back at Pantheon by a young South African writer named Zoe Wickham. The book was called You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. And the galleys came in, and I'd never done this before, and I thought, who would I like to endorse my first book? And I was very aspirational and sent it out to a bunch of people. And the very first blurb on my very first book called Zoe Wickham an extraordinary writer, seductive, brilliant, and precious. Her talent glitters. And that was Professor Morrison. So I hope you'll be happy to hear that 25 years later, the New Press is still publishing Zoe Wickham. We published her novel October last year. On every book of hers that I have ever published, I have put her quote over and over. No fool. And I don't know if you know this, but Zoe went on to win a major award in 2013, the inaugural Wyndham Campbell Prize for Lifetime Achievement in fiction writing, which came with a lot of money and a lot of accolades, and you know how to pick them. So, and then something that I know you're aware of because you made it happen, Toni Morrison has graciously allowed us to include in a forthcoming book of radical graduation speeches, one of her graduation speeches. The book is being edited by my colleague Tara Grove. The book is called The World is Waiting for You. It will come out next year. And in it is a commencement speech that Toni Morrison gave at Rutgers in 2011 called The Pursuit of Meaningfulness. And I'm going to read you just a couple of unbelievably powerful sentences from that speech, if I may. Toni Morrison said to the Rutgers kids, "I have often wished that Thomas Jefferson had not used the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, as the third right. I would rather he had I'm sorry, it's abridged. I hope that's okay. I can go ... when I'm... I would rather he had written life, liberty, and the pursuit of meaningfulness, or integrity, or truth. But I urge you, please don't settle for happiness. It's not good enough. If that is all you have in mind, happiness, I want to suggest to you that personal success devoid of meaningfulness, free of a steady commitment to social justice, that's more than a barren life. It is a trivial one." So many congratulations to two legends, to two of my personal heroes. Thank you again for being here tonight. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Farai Chideya for her lovely remarks and for setting such a beautiful tone for us here. Thank you to Gara LaMarche and Farah Griffin for their presentations of our awards. Thank you to our host committee chairs, Ed and Tom, Amy and Andy. Can you guys wave? Where are you? I see Ed. Thank you. To our sponsors and host committee members, everybody wave. Identify yourselves. There are a lot of you. Thank you. Board members, New Press board members. I know there are a lot of you here tonight. The New Press staff. Where are my wonderful colleagues? Please raise your hand. And among the staff, I especially want to call out Chelsea Miller. I believe every person in this room has been in touch with Chelsea personally. And her tireless colleagues, Essie Hutchbull, Erica Wong, Nikki Marin, and Jed Vickman. Thank you so much for making tonight the beautiful event that it is. One other colleague I'd like to mention is Carl Bromley. Carl is our brand new editorial director as of a couple of months ago. There's Carl. I hope you'll... Woo! Carl! I hope you'll introduce yourselves to Carl. He's lovely, he's brilliant, he's British, he's a little hard to understand. What did you tell me the other day? I'd thrown a spanner in the works? Anyway, if you would like to pitch your book ideas to Carl, you can bid on Lunch with Carl Bromley at the auction, and your bid will be matched. Lastly, I want to speak very, very briefly about our efforts to leverage the books we publish to create social change. January will mark the 5th anniversary of the publication of The New Jim Crow, which is the poster child these days for books that leverage social change. I was invited a couple of weeks ago by a group called Media Impact Partners to speak to a group of foundation funders and individual donors about books and other cultural artifacts like documentary films that do leverage social change. There's a poster with some of my remarks if you want to hear what I have to say. But what I want to say tonight is that it is your support, the people in this room and beyond this room, that has allowed us to go beyond the traditional role of a book publisher and to create a truly new hybrid organization, many of whose activities, like trying to leverage social change, are not revenue generating. So with your ongoing support, the New Press will continue to publish books that inspire and incite, and then to try to leverage those books to make a difference in the world. Thank you for joining us for our annual gathering, where we pay tribute to our heroes in the social justice and publishing fields. We celebrate our year's successes, and we look forward together with all of you to the future of public interest book publishing.